Fescar ma Huladúnia, agus fáilte ormh gan Ciat Session Gaelic, Old Ways, New Roads, gon Élan Lan de Hantirian, Olahai Glasgow. Is docha Slian is Ratchan an sa Gaelic. Hashin Care Lucht Lavar Sparrel a program anoch, agus Hami a Gianu Fucher Rish. So I'm Nigel Leask, Professor of English Literature at the University of Glasgow. I'm co-curator of the exhibition, Old Ways, New Roads, along with Angela Beveridge and John Bonehill. I'm delighted to introduce my distinguished co-convener for the first of these two Gaelic sessions, Uisdean Cheape, who's professor at Sabhal Mòr Ostaig, the Isle of Skye. And Uisdean has contributed a wonderful chapter to our book entitled On the Ethnography of the Old Ways in Gaelic Scotland. So Uisdean has kindly agreed to present our four speakers for the evening. And I'll just hand over to you then, Uisdean.
Thank you, Nigel. Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to be with you tonight and to have the opportunity of introducing our four speakers. And I will do so severally as they each speak, but just to get us all prepared, so to speak, they are Peter O'Murchety, Don William Stewart, Kate Louise Mathis, and Nurse McCunny. And that will give you a sense, I'm sure, of where we're going with our contributions tonight. And it's a very exciting process whereby the exhibition has gone online and we are now broadening the whole picture, but more so in a way because we are adding and broadening, I feel, the historiography of a subject which perhaps is quite conventional, but has been treated in a fresh and unconventional manner. And by so doing, I do believe that we are lending new authority to historical evidence, and we're establishing new intellectual positions for the use of information from a variety of sources, such as we explore this evening. So without more ado, if I could ask our first speaker, Peter O'Murchety, to give his paper In Search of Old Ways, James McLagan's Tour of 1774. Peter is lecturer in Celtic Studies at the University of Copenhagen and at Aberystwyth University. And so over to you, Peter.
Thank you all. Thanks, Uisdean, very much. I hope that that people can see my screen, or hope that if they can't, that they will. I'll hear them shouting in cyberspace. I can't see anybody's face at the moment, so I'm reliant on my colleagues. It's a real pleasure to contribute to this series of talks on Old Ways and New Roads, which is a really inspired theme, I think. Like many of you, I'm sure I've been following the events online associated with the exhibition, and I found them extremely stimulating, and I have learned a huge amount from them. It's perhaps so my title, as you'll see tonight, is In Search of Old Ways, James McLagan's Tour of 1774, and it's perhaps a bit of a bold move to talk about a Highland tour as part of this series. Many others have already spoken on aspects of the Highland tour. Our two conveners tonight have contributed to the Old Ways, New Roads Travels in Scotland book, and indeed one of our conveners and hosts has literally written the book on the topic. But I want to focus in more specifically on one tour which has a more particular relevance in the context of tonight's Gaelic session. Many of you will know, indeed many of you will know much better than me, that Thomas Pennant's Voyage to the Hebrides was published in Chester on the 19th of May 1774. It was the first instalment of Pennant's published tour in Scotland, which had been undertaken in 1772. In 1775, Dr. Johnson's Journey to the Western Islands was also published, documenting the English lexicographer's tour of the Hebrides made in the summer of 1773. In the summer of 1774, however, between the publication of Pennant's tour and that of Johnson, another tour of the Hebrides was undertaken by someone with a very different perspective on Gaelic-speaking Scotland. So as I said, I'll just to recap very briefly, many of you will know better than me that Thomas Pennant's Voyage to the Hebrides was published in Chester on the 19th of May in 1774. It was the first instalment of Pennant's published tour in Scotland, which had been undertaken in 1772. In 1775, Dr. Johnson's Journey to the Western Islands was also published, documenting the English lexicographer's tour of the Hebrides made in the summer of 1773. In the summer of 1774, however, between the publication of Pennant's tour and that of Johnson, another tour of the Hebrides was undertaken by someone with a very different perspective on Gaelic-speaking Scotland. That person was the Reverend James McLagan. Born in 1728, a native Gaelic speaker from Highland Perthshire, McLagan is one of those many 18th century Scots whose life proceeded along old ways and new roads, sometimes intersecting, sometimes running in parallel. He was educated for the ministry in St Andrews University, and he would later be appointed chaplain to the Black Watch Regiment. And of course, in becoming chaplain to the Black Watch Regiment, he succeeded another Gaelic-speaking chaplain who became better known as a philosopher, Adam Ferguson. As chaplain to the Black Watch, McLagan served with the British Army during the American War of Independence, as well as in Ireland and in the Isle of Man. So that in this respect, he had what we might call new road credentials. But it's for his interest in the old ways that he's remembered today. McLagan was probably the 18th century's greatest collector of Gaelic literature, as well as a poet and composer of Gaelic songs himself. His extant collection consists of almost 2,000 manuscript pages, largely but not exclusively preserved in Glasgow University Library. And here you can see, or you should be able to see, I hope, an image of the man himself as featured on a poster for a conference held at the Royal Irish Academy a number of years ago, co-organised by myself and colleagues Cheape and Geraldine Parsons from Celtic and Gaelic at Glasgow. In the summer of 1774, McLagan left Dublin, where he was then stationed with his regiment, and sailed north in a ship belonging to Stornoway. If McLagan's 1774 tour punctuates in chronological terms those of Pennant and Johnson, it follows a third famous tour in terms of, or travel writing, let's say, in terms of form. Like Burt's Letters from the North of Scotland, James McLagan's tour takes the form of letters addressed to an unidentified correspondent. These, I think it's about 10 letters in all. It's a while since I've actually looked at the manuscripts themselves. There is one missing. These are now preserved in Dundee City Archive. One might dismiss this epistolary form as literary convention, but it seems to me worthwhile at least entertaining the notion that the tour was intended possibly for one of the Murray family of the Dukes of Atholl. Stray references to Dunkeld, a Perthshire election, as well as to North America, make me think that General Lord John Murray, a regimental colonel of the Black Watch, is one possible candidate. Unlike most visitors to the Highlands in the 18th century, McLagan departed from the beaten track. He visited the Western Isles, including Louise, which famously tended to be left off the 18th century equivalent of TripAdvisor. McLagan's tour of 1774 proceeds from Dublin, offering a brief account of McLagan's Manx connections as he passed the Isle of Man to his right, and then via the Mull of Kintyre to Gia, Ling, Jura, Islay, Oronsay, Colonsay, Iona, Staffa, Mull, Barra, Eriskay, South Uist, Benbecula, North Uist, Harris and Lewis, and then on to Skye before he proceeds through the Highlands on his way home. His tour gives us an ethnographic account of Gaelic-speaking Scotland written from the perspective of a Gaelic speaker. It's also exceptional on account of his own familiarity with the Hebrides. This was not his first tour of the Highlands and Islands or the Western Isles. In 1770, McLagan, on leave from the Black Watch, based himself on the inner Hebridean Isle of Lismore, where his friend and fellow cleric collector, the Reverend Donald McNichol, was minister. Taking Lismore as his base, McLagan toured the inner and outer Hebrides in search of songs, so that by 1774, McLagan already had some sense of the Western Isles. The broader background to the 1774 tour has recently been discussed by Dr. Alan Turner in the Transactions of the Gaelic Society of Inverness, but McLagan's tour is also valuable in very specific ways. As I've already said, the McLagan collection, now largely preserved in Glasgow University Library, consists of almost 2,000 manuscript pages of material, Gaelic poetry, history, extensive Fenian and or Ossianic ballads. This represents a huge volume of material, but it also represents wide interaction with scholars, clerics, tradition bearers, and other Gaelic speakers from across the entire Gaelic-speaking region. Taking the text of the tour, what I want to do in this short presentation this evening is to look at how it can shed unique light on two of the recurring themes of 18th century travel writing associated with the Highlands and Islands. The first of these is literature, and the second relates to social change and improvement. Turning then to literature, I want to start in Islay, where McLagan, in good antiquarian form, sets about describing local sites of historical interest. Unlike so many other writers, however, McLagan is in a position to pepper his accounts of these places with meaningful cultural and literary references. And he does so here in describing Dunavag Castle. Here too is Dunavag, one of MacDonald's places of residence, situated on a rock over a foul and dangerous sea. It was once strong and contained a number of apartments. I have met with a poem composed by Argyll to a daughter of MacDonald when living there, wherein he greatly envies the young lady's lapdog, for it seems young ladies even then had such things. Now, lo and behold, we can locate this poem within the extant Glasgow University Library collection. This is the poem to which McLagan is referring, and you see it here with an image of the manuscript. It has the heading, A Love Song by Argyll, that is to say the Earl of Argyll, to a daughter of MacDonald of Islay. It's a relatively short poem, and in it the poet does indeed refer to the lady's lapdog, saying that he's jealous of the lapdog who can spend the night in her company. 2 years later, in 1776, the poem would appear in print in the Egg Collection, an anthology of Gaelic poetry compiled by Ranald MacDonald, the son of the famous Gaelic poet Alistair Mcpherson Alistair, and published in Edinburgh. It's clear that there's a very close textual relationship between McLagan's text of the poem and that published in the Egg Collection. But so too does the Egg Collection echo McLagan's description of the poem in his tour journal by referring to the poem's composition specifically at a time when MacDonald of Islay lived in the now ruined castle. If the ascription given by both McLagan and Ranald MacDonald is correct, then the poem probably belongs to the 16th century. That would easily see it fit within the type of Gaelic, I should say, incorporating both Irish and Scottish Gaelic, a more courtois poetry we see in Irish manuscripts and also for instance, in the Scottish Book of the Dean of Lismore, as recently examined by Professor William Gillis. The poem therefore raises all sorts of interesting questions about McLagan's sources, as well as those of Ranald MacDonald. And it also provides a further example of the textual history of McLagan's collection being intertwined in perhaps unexpected ways with the Egg Collection. One of the most interesting descriptions of place in McLagan's tour is, perhaps unsurprisingly, Iona, the centre of medieval Gaelic Christianity and the monastic settlement established by Columcille, or St. Columba, who was born 1,500 years ago, 1,500 years ago this month. I hope to say something about the McLagan's trip to Iona elsewhere at some point, so I won't dwell on it too long here, except to highlight one comment which sheds light on a few items in McLagan's collection. So in providing an account of Columcille, McLagan states, and I should say that it's factually erroneous, but that's not the problem, or that's not the issue. So the Columcille was from Arran in Ireland, which I take to have been an island off the coast of Ulster, rather than the Arran in the Bay of Galway and Connacht. Be that as it will, he aimed at some higher dignity in a monastery, and there had a rival that got the better of him, so that he was obliged or chose to decamp. Upon this occasion, he wrote an Irish poem bidding farewell to his beloved Arran, of which I have had a copy from the curious and learned Major Valancy. The Major Valancy here mentioned is the English-born but Irish-obsessed antiquarian and engineer who was very much a feature of the Dublin scholarly circle in which McLagan became involved after being posted to Ireland in the late 1760s. The poem Celibrid Wemshe Dáran is found in the McLagan collection, where it appears without any mention of Major Valancy. There are in fact two texts in this manuscript. The first, Celibrid Wemshe Dáran, is the one mentioned by McLagan in the tour, and it's examined more closely in a forthcoming article by Thomas Clancy. The same manuscript, however, contains a number of riddles written in Middle Irish or Middle Gaelic, which a number of years ago, my colleague Cheape, with some excellent detective work, connected to the Dublin scribe Muirish O'Gorman. O'Gorman was Valancy's amanuensis, and therefore the hypothesis suggested by Cheape of a line of transmission from 18th century Dublin to Highland Perthshire is rendered watertight by McLagan's observation on the physical landscape of Iona made in the summer of 1774. Both Argyll's love song and Valancy's Middle Gaelic riddles allow us to better understand the reception of late medieval and early modern Gaelic literature in the 18th century Highlands and Islands, and the important role of James McLagan as a conduit through whose hands literary texts passed. As well as offering new solutions to old problems, McLagan's tour also reveals new, we could call them problems or we could call them mysteries. One such problem or mystery, let's go with mystery, still awaiting a solution, is the identity of the Mackay poet encountered by McLagan in South Uist, or at least mysterious to me, I should say. Where he says, the inhabitants of South Uist and Barra are almost all papists. There is one Mackay in South Uist who repeated some good poems to me as his own compositions. It should be said that the ellipsis there actually represents an observation that there was a woman, a girl in South Uist, who even in the depths of winter would not wear any clothes. I thought it may be best to excise that as it didn't quite run with the tone of the rest of the observations, but it's interesting nonetheless. With that in mind, I want to turn now briefly to the tour and its observations on Gaelic literature and culture in an age of so-called improvement. The scale of social change in the Highlands was dramatic during McLagan's lifetime. While guiding his reader through the Argyll coast, he describes a mid-16th century battle between the MacDonalds of Islay and the McQuillans of Dunluce in County Antrim. You see Dunluce Castle, County Antrim, in the image in front of you. McLagan remarks, "There were poems and songs on the occasion, but they are dying fast and hard to be got, now that people have neither time nor spirit for them." In the description of his visit to Iona, McLagan speculates on the name of Columcille, and again, this is there's no basis to this speculation, but that doesn't make it any the less interesting. And that's not what I want to highlight here either. What I want to highlight here is rather the resonance that this observation may have had in the context of the 18th century, in particular in what we might call the 18th century Scottish cultural fringe, as well as the perception of Scotland within a broader British context. Because I think McLagan's historical observation here had a contemporary 18th century relevance. He says Cullum was the man's name, and Kill is in probability from Kell, a retired corner or cave, in which places the first Christians in Scotland loved and frequented much, and they were called Culdich, which name was afterwards Latinized Culdee, and an etymology sought for it in Latin, because we either did not understand the language of the country or despised whatever was our own in imitation of others who were as ignorant of them as ourselves, and hated them and us to boot. In closing, I want to turn to the issue of emigration to America, which came to the fore very much in North Uist in the 1770s. McLagan's observation runs as follows. The people are all Protestant in North Uist. Many of them are substantial, decent, and well-bred people, but they all threaten to go to America whenever their leases are out, which will be the case in a short time. Sad improvement this to banish the most valuable and best from among us, and to retain the dregs and refuse. Or, supposing they should stay, to force them to become as poor, ignorant, and unpolished as the very lowest classes. There is veiled criticism here of Sir Alexander MacDonald, the local landlord in Clan Cheape, and my suspicion is that the rhetoric is significantly toned down. And this is possibly likely if McLagan is, as I've speculated, writing to one of the Murrays of Atholl, a member of the Highland aristocracy, then he might be well advised to not be too critical. However, we can compare this observation from the tour with a personal letter written just 4 years later to his fellow collector, Reverend Ewan McDermott, where he says that there are a few landlords of 500 a year, but after they have fleeced their tenants, run away to another country to spend it and leave their own to misery and barbarity. The same sentiment is also found in the North Uist poet John McCodrum's very well known Oran the Fogarich, or a song to the exiles. The emigration, which was also highly critical of MacDonald, although again in a way which was slightly veiled. The emigration to North Uist, to North America from Uist, was at an all-time new height in the 1770s. And it's another one of those points at which old ways and new roads intersected. And because of that, it might be an appropriate place to stop.
Thank you, Peter. That was wonderful. We're already far down the new ways on the old roads to discover new perspectives on the Highlands and Islands. So if we could go on now to my colleague, Don William Stewart, who is senior lecturer, course leader in the MSc program at Sabhal Mòr Ostaig, Culture Dúchasoch, is Echter in the Gaeltoch. And Don William is speaking on The Drover in Gaelic song and story. So over to you, Don William. Mòr Ostaig.
Mòr Ostaig. Now, I'd better, we've already had problems already with this setup, so I just want to make sure that everybody can see this all right. Is that, yeah, we're getting there with Zoom. So anyway, it's Droverach. It won't be a leisurely drove at all. It's going to be a forced route march, I'm afraid, through the subject of droving. But thanks very much for coming. I'll try to get this done 15 minutes. So there's going to be a lot of paper being slinging around the room as I jump from paragraph to paragraph. Some basic preliminary points is that the Highland drover, I know the Highland drover is a well-known figure, but any glance at 18th or 19th century sources show that most drovers were emphatically not from the Highlands. Highland drovers were a relatively small but conspicuous fraction of a much larger droving profession composed of lowlanders and English drovers as well as Highlanders. Also, the other point is to make is that drovers, they drive sheep as well as cows. And we should always remember, I think, that certainly in the later droving period, the 19th century, at least as many sheep were sold in southern markets as cows, if not more. Finally, very briefly, we're talking about a trade which is comparable to, and it can only be understood properly in the context of this European-wide commerce. The growth of urban centres across Europe requires the urban population to be fed with beef, and that means that droving trade of oxen and of cows, many of which are much more impressive than the Highland cows, spreads across Europe, as you can see from the time just after the Black Death onwards. It is very, very under-researched, primarily because of the difficulties of coordinating cattle prices, working them out among different countries over long periods of time, comparing documents in different languages and the like. But it is there, and I just find I tried to stop myself falling down an oxen rabbit hole when I was working on this paper, but it certainly isn't easy. There's new work coming out all the time, just as there is with Highland droving. The Bible on the subject, of course, is The Drove Roads of Scotland by Alexander Richard Burton Haldane, 1900-1902, published in 1952. Haldane used this as his PhD thesis. He actually gave a printed book in as his PhD thesis. And being a PhD thesis, you can therefore get a copy of the book online for free at the University of Edinburgh Digital Repository. It's lovely to imagine our own theses being published before we handed them in, but that's not going to happen with mine. It's extremely rare that a history book over 20 years old is still consulted and taken seriously, let alone one composed well over half a century ago. Most of our work, I'm afraid, is doomed to gather dust on the shelves or to be consigned to secondhand bookshops if we're lucky within a generation. But Haldane's work is very, very different. It's comprehensive, it's enthusiastic, it's authoritative, fluently and elegantly written. It's packed with fascinating detail, and it's clearly informed by a rare combination of deep knowledge of legal sources combined with a deep knowledge of the countryside. In fact, it's so good that it destroyed research on the subject for 2 generations after its publication. I should point out it's not just a sort of a survey from documents, but Haldane did actually go around talking to plenty of elderly drovers, and his papers now in the National Libraries are full of letters and interviews with drovers and their families, work which we could certainly draw on and has been drawn on, as we'll see shortly, for future work on droves. As I said, Haldane, in a sense, people felt, well, there's no point doing any extra work on cattle droves because Haldane has done everything for us. And that was the case, I think, for about 50 years, but new work is being done now on the droving trade and on drovers. I should begin, in fact, before I move on to the next one, by actually mentioning Uisdean McConaughey, who we're going to hear from later on this evening. His work is still to be published, but it is an incontrovertible demonstration of how significant the cattle trade was to the Highland region, going back as far as the 16th century. It's really important work, and I'm looking forward to reading that in print. One book which has appeared in print in Gaelic is this sort of wonderful compendium of cultural material about Highland cattle in Gaelic culture. Singing songs in the cattle, about the cattle fold, cattle in life and the culture, the heritage of the Gaels, by Sean Greker in Edinburgh. It's an excellent book. I can recommend it very strongly. There's a recent, again, you can get this online, a recent survey by Andrew Wiseman. It's an excellent survey of a particular Highland drover, in fact, the very quintessence of the Highland drover, John Cameron of Carrigalia, in the first half of the 19th century. Finally, there are these two very important PhDs, both from the same year, as you can see, 2014, both from the University of Glasgow, neither of them from a history department. They're sophisticated, innovative, they add texture and depth to Haldane's work. And one of them, the one on your left here, even takes Haldane himself as a character in the story of the history of droving. So Richard Loudon, historical geographer, and Donald Adamson, archaeology of droving. And again, they're both free. You can get them free. You don't need to pay a penny, from the University of Glasgow's digital repository. And I'd recommend them very strongly. Great reads, and they're a great example of how historians can learn from historical geographers on the one hand and archaeologists on the other. And it is an encouragement for all of us, these theses, to get out of our offices, to get our noses perhaps temporarily at least out of archival documents and get into the physical landscape and walk around and look at the historical traces of droving on the landscape. Cattle raising is as fundamental to the Highland economy as it was for any number of pastoral societies throughout the world, including the Scottish borders. Crucial source of status in clan society. There were movable assets bestowed as marriage dowry and in return for fosterage, among others. Very, very quickly, because time is pressing on, as Highland chiefs were absorbed into the economic network, first Scottish and British, they incurred debts, they needed money, and despite the long-standing lowland dreams that the Scottish Gaeltacht might be made to yield untold wealth from agriculture and fisheries, the best way to secure hard cash was to build the already existing cattle trade. This development affected the entire clan, so tenants' rents began increasingly to be paid in cash, and of course the best way to make cash, I should say, was by selling cattle. And this begins slowly and with an indigenous enterprise. And we are told, whether it's true or not, that one of the first cattle drovers in Skye was the old warrior hero, Don Macian Hamish. And this suggests, and this is a point which I'll be referring to later on at the very end of this very brief run through the droving history, there is no contradiction between, if you like, being a member or even a fighter in the traditional valiant mode and having a hard nose for business. That certainly comes through during the 17th century, especially the second half of the 1600s, with a startling rise of bands of armed caterans or cattle thieves on the Highland periphery from the 1620s onwards. It's not just a testament to political disruption, to political dislocation, but it's also a testament to the growth of the cattle trade itself and the development of markets on the edges of the lowlands, where cattle which were stolen could then be sold or fenced with no questions asked. These new generation of cattle thieves, they posed as social bandits, they posed as protectors of the people, they posed as upholders of a traditional way of life, but in reality they could not have functioned without the existence of a market economy in which to sell and profit from their ill-gotten gains. And as I've said, the cattle trade grew exponentially in the second half of the 1600s, following especially the late 1660s ban on the Irish cattle imports in order to protect English cattle breeders, and exports of cattle from Scotland thereupon shot up. Now, as a result of this intensification of the trade, various developments in the Highlands, first of all, we can be fairly sure, following Alan McInnes and Robert Dodgson, that the countryside altered markedly as a result. Much more land which had previously been devoted to agriculture must have been given over to pasture, whether for the summer or for the winter. Again, we have a whole new commercial infrastructure created through which the cattle trade could be encouraged. We have this network of fairs and markets, small events where drovers could go and buy local cattle in order to fatten them up and sell them on for a profit at the main lowland trice, above all the market in Crieff, and then later the market in Falkirk. Finally, the consequences of increased droving may have been even more far-reaching in the Gaeltacht, given that the expansion in the cattle trade may have been one contributory factor to what's been suggested historical geographer Robert Dodgson as a bringing together or a nucleating of previously scattered Highland townships in order to ensure more pasture and more economic use of land. So it actually changed the way that people lived in townships. It's worth briefly touching on just how drovers paid for the cattle they bought at local markets in the Highlands. They had two options. They could either use banknotes obtained by trading in your bill of exchange, or else through personal promissory notes, which could be exchanged for banknotes at most 3 months after the animal had been sold. And that second form of payment was the more common. And we find promissory notes effectively functioning as valid currency, sometimes circulating for a very long time and financing other trade as well. So we've got a whole system which is being run on credit, the more so after 1728, when the Royal Bank of Scotland introduced a credit cash system open to any person with 2 reputable guarantors. So we get drovers then being financed by other investors such as merchants, goldsmiths, commercial houses in Edinburgh. It's a really interesting illustration of how outside investment played an important part in developing the Highland economy and incorporating it at all levels into wider financial markets centred upon London. And by the end of the 18th century, we find banks having representatives at the major cattle markets. They're linking the informal and the formal currency systems. But basically, the system is run on credit and was exposed to very high risk, the more so given that very few drovers had many assets to their name at all, and that few appeared to adhere to anything like what we would call acceptable standards of accountancy. So, you know, if we look at the folklore which has been gathered in the late 19th century, in the 1890s, by people such as another McLachlan, I should say, Robert Craig McLachlan, or Alexander Carmichael, we get lines like this: "Nur va fiúr a cach go mi traitje chief, big ma sporan clay want, good ma want for each pain." So, you know, even though everybody expected that I was bankrupt, I still had a full purse, even though I never signed a contract in my life. So it's a very high risk trade. And that meant that, you know, the droving network was networks of information, people trying to gauge the present and future state of market prices. Prices dependent on the weather, on the incidence of disease, on demand, of course, in the cities. And given that this was an era of war, with the British Navy and Army operating in salt beef, they were looking also at the domestic and indeed the international political situation. So we've got a market networks, with the droving trade operating, and this involving many thousands of Gaels trying to gather and gauge and assess information concerning the outside world and acting accordingly. And all this hones skills in finance, in bargaining, in organising, and in marketing. And it's very nice. It's a nice example of a boys' game from Argyllshire called Creating and Daff, or Selling the Oxen. And the aim was that one of the lads played a drover, and he had to bargain with his friend playing the farmer for every one of the farmer's cows that were played by the rest of the gang. So we see, you know, capitalism, we see money skills sort of seeping down to the very lowest levels of society, to boys playing games in Argyllshire. I should mention drove roads, of course, binding the Highlands to the rest of Britain, and not only binding the Highlands to the rest of Britain, but also binding smaller kindreds together, kindreds that would cooperate either by renewing long-standing relationships or else by creating new ones. We've got McKinnons and McGregors, we've got the Stewarts of Appin with the McLarens of Balwydder. They're resurrecting or maybe recreating old relationships for the economic benefit of both in the droving trade. But there's also, not only bringing about new friendships, but also there's new hostilities. We have drovers wandering in an unfamiliar land with lots of money. And therefore, we have stories such as 2 McGregor drovers who were murdered by Macmillans near Lochark in the wilds of the Rough Bounds there. And their guilt was discovered when one of them was met lighting his pipe with an elaborately printed piece of paper. And upon inquiring about it, the other man was told that there was plenty more of them at a certain place. And these indeed were banknotes, which were found on the drovers, although the Macmillans were quite unaware of what banknotes were and their value. Moving very swiftly on as time is going on. There are all sorts of different phases. Haldane makes very important points in the Drove Road Scotland. The droving trade was not a single historical fact, but it is a process made up of different phases during which different districts were bound together through a single trade until its rapid demise, primarily because of the rise of the railways in the late 19th century. And at the center of this trade was the figure of the drover, an iconic one in the oral tradition of the late 1800s at least, with endurance, canniness, good eye, quick wit, and skill at driving a hard bargain. Here's Dougal McInnes writing out a story about drovers for Alexander Carmichael in the 1890s. 2 brothers went to Trice to sell a cow. While one of them was away, the other sold the cow. On his return, he asked his brother whom he had sold the cow to, and the brother said that he didn't know his name, he didn't know the drover's name, but that Vakot the Goromed, Breken Oer, a worn face, that is a weather-beaten face, Sulan Advoyan, I'm not quite sure what that means, I think it means eyes peering under his hat, Stronruach, yes, Kochgoch, Nagoplach, Uacher, Shekoni, Kagnich, Namach. Dun breeches, a hemp rope, or possibly a cortroch, a knife in his upper doublet, and he's always chewing tobacco. And of course, the joke is that all drovers looked like that at the time. Drovers need to be extremely hardy, of course, and we have various admiring remarks preserved in the archives of the old timers who walked every step of the way to Falkirk in their bare feet. It's surviving very little. We have one man telling Callum MacLean of a drover in the Braes of Abernethy who only had broken English, and he told him, I was on the road at that time and the deal of thing that I ate for it 4 days, but I too savage. And with savage he meant 2 sandwiches. So very quickly to conclude then, drovers are one of several groups of people who left their townships in the Highland behind them to earn money at this time of harvest. People, packsmen, labourers, factory workers, and later herring gutters as well. And they in effect, to go back because Nigel is in charge of this evening, they in fact told travel narratives about their travels, and often these travel narratives concerned themselves going into the wilderness. They were leaving the township, they were leaving the safety of civilization, if you like, and they're going into the wilderness. And the wilderness is where you would meet thieves, where you'd meet all sorts of éigearí of criminals who would try to steal your money. And it also, in some cases, it is where you'd meet fairies. And we have stories of drovers being kidnapped by fairies when they're out in the wilderness there and taken away to the fairy hill and kept there for many a moon, many a month, or many a year. And indeed, some would meet the devil as well. So they were to conclude what's been a very, very quick tour of droving. They were not just about cattle, but capitalism, in a sense, it included superstition. It included culture, included Gaelic superstition, it included Gaelic culture as well. It's all connected, and you can see the droving trade as it spreads throughout the Highlands. It's a means of poets and indeed pipers making a reputation throughout the Highlands. You get drovers making songs, telling stories, and these songs and stories are taken up by other drovers. They're performed at the Great Cattle Trice in Crieff and then Falkirk. And as a result, we get this, if you like, this greater sense of a unity of Scottish Gaeldom as a result. So drovers they're absolutely crucial to our culture as well as to our economy. And I think I'd better end it there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was very exciting and very important as from two particular points of view, urging us to look again at well-tried sources, conventional sources, and also to leave the archives and get out to the open country and pick up the sights and sounds.
Yes.
So we'll move on to our next speaker, Kate Louise Mathis, Dr. Kate Louise Mathis, who's lecturer in Celtic and Gaelic Studies in the University of Glasgow. And she is talking to us on the subject, Will No One Tell Me What She Sings? Observing Gaelic Women Poets in the Scottish Gaeltacht. Kate, cumorst.
Morning time, Uisdean, agus Nigel, and thank you to everybody who is here with us. I hope you can hear me sufficiently. I'm some distance from my screen. I'm going to talk briefly about the Mcphersonian or the Ossianic element, and then move on to some external perspectives by other women writers on women in the Scottish Gaeltacht who they may or may not have an interest in as composers in their own right. But I'm going to begin with James Mcpherson, albeit still anonymous, in the preface to his Fragments of Ancient Poetry in 1760, when he referred to the practice of verse making and the bardic craft as an exclusively masculine profession. He asserted too the innate masculinity of epic verse and the requisite process of tradition bearing among the ancient Celts that he claimed had preserved the words once sung by Ossian. There can be no doubt, opines the preface, and please forgive its contemporary terminology, there can be no doubt that these poems are to be ascribed to the bards, a race of men known to have continued throughout many ages in Ireland and the north of Scotland, whose office it was to record in verse the illustrious actions specific to chiefs and yet more great men. By the succession of these bards, it concluded, such poems were handed down from race to race, and tradition has preserved many of them in a great measure incorrupted to this day. Mcpherson's conviction was echoed, unsurprisingly, in his associate Hugh Blair's critical dissertation on the poems of Ossian, published in 1763 amid the first wave of controversy anent the fragment's authenticity and that of its rapidly presented successors Fingal and Temora. Initially standalone, Blair's spirited defence of Ossian's antiquity and artistic merit was incorporated by subsequent editions, prolonging the assertion of this rediscovered epic as a male production in every sense. In terms of the fragments itself, there is little contradiction in Mcpherson's claim, which is appropriate to other contemporary speculations on the ancient Caledonians' intellectuals, for example, but which also validates the content of the poems themselves, in which only the agency of Ossian is apparent. It is his character's voice that predominates, sometimes addressing his audience directly, and sometimes assuming the voices of those whom his verses lament. In Fingal, however, published in 1762, a problem occurs to complicate the overtly masculine heredity that Mcpherson has alleged for the race of men on which the bardic profession depends. With the death of Oscar, Ossian's son, otherwise a fact significant to establishing his fate as the longest-lived survivor of his generation, the poet has no successor, and no male heir to inherit the verses that preserve his generation's heroic deeds, or by implication, that preserve the deeds of those who came before them. Fingal, therefore, introduces Malvina, betrothed to Ossian's son Oscar before his death, who, we are told, became his aging father's companion thereafter. As Ossian's attendant throughout the wider narrative that Fingal's books unfold, Malvina is addressed repeatedly by the frail, sightless poet and invoked as the nearest audience for his recollections. She is not, however, presented as a merely passive listener, but as the poet's successor, a seemingly contrary female successor for Ossian and a subsequent tradition bearer, the intended conduit for passing on his songs. This is made explicit by Mcpherson more than once, for example, concluding his rendition of a supplemental poem, The War of Caros. Ossian instructs Malvina, "Bring me the harp, O maid, that I may touch it. Be thou near to learn my song, and future times shall hear of Ossian." It is notable, however, that Malvina's agency is limited to transmitting that which Ossian has made. Her voice is permitted to mingle with his only insofar as she will repeat his words. Her potential capacity for independent composition is also denied. Another supplemental poem, Chroma, opens with her lamentation for Oscar in a section referred to typically as Malvina's Dream. Her song is overheard by Ossian, who seeks to distract her from her grief with the tale of his youthful liberation of Chroma, an Irish kingdom. But he observes beforehand that the beauty of her lament is derivative, modelled on the skills of performers whose talent she has absorbed. "Thou hast heard the music of departed bards," he declares. "Thou hast heard the music of bards, and thy own song is lovely." While Ossian's critique may be interpreted as an accurate reflection of the oral tradition, genuine oral tradition, in which innovation of content rather than style was rarely encouraged, its dismissal of Malvina's song is appropriate to the fact that her role is otherwise depicted by Mcpherson as extraordinary, a concession to Oscar's premature death. As Juliet Shields has observed, Malvina's strictly atypical role was acknowledged by Hugh Blair's dissertation, which, as we saw, follows Mcpherson's preface to the fragments in, quote, conceiving of poets as uniformly male, perhaps because the poem's female bards are an aberration, the unfortunate if necessary consequence of failures of patrilineal inheritance, unquote. That's from Shields' excellent discussion of Mcpherson's women. The fascinating work of Joellen de Lucia, moreover, suggests that Malvina's contribution to Chroma was embellished by Mcpherson at the behest of his friend, the blue-stocking feminist writer Elizabeth Montagu, with whom Mcpherson had shared a draft of Chroma prior to Fingal's publication. Part of this draft survives in Montagu's letters, which imply that Malvina's status as Ossian's successor arose in light of Montagu and her friends, most of whom were also writers, attraction to the concept of an historical female bard. Secondly, however, Malvina's status in the text is fleeting as well as potentially begrudged. When Ossian calls out to her in Fingal's final supplemental poem, Barathon, her disembodied voice reveals to him suddenly, "I passed, O Fingal." The fact of Malvina's decease is not otherwise explored. It seems to result from her grief for Oscar. But Ossian pauses in his contemplation of the Fianna's banished exploits to lament her, observing that her absence has ensured the silence of those who went before and those who remain. "Thou hast left us in darkness," he complains. "We sit at the rock and there is no voice." As Murdo MacDonald has observed, quote, "The fact that Malvina dies before Ossian himself may reflect an understandable pessimism on Mcpherson's part for the future of Gaelic culture," unquote, and that killing off Malvina, however vaguely, makes explicit his own grief for the erosion of the genuine, mature literary traditions of the Scottish Gaeltacht and the combined threat to the way of life that had sustained its actual transmitters for numerous generations prior to Culloden. While plausible, it is also possible to read Malvina's failure to fulfil her role as Mcpherson's comment on the inherent unsuitability of women to act as tradition bearers. just as perhaps the narrowness of his depiction of her briefly held possession as Ossian's apprentice may imply reluctance to acknowledge the ability of women poets to contribute to Gaelic culture or to compose original verse. If we turn from the fiction of Mcpherson's Ossian to the actual status of women poets in the Scottish Gaeltacht contemporary to the time of its publication in 1760, it is clear, in fact, that the demise of Malvina coincided with the increasing visibility of Gaelic women poets' actual work within the manuscript collections that flourished in the latter half of the 18th century, as we've heard, and with the arrival of women into Gaelic print, including the earliest single-authored anthology assembled by a female poet, Mairead Cameron, in 1785. While the irony is somewhat delicious, given the immense popularity of Mcpherson's Ossian and the initially significant role of Malvina, which continued to be felt, it is also fair to consider the extent to which a connection between these phenomena may exist, or specifically, if the Ossian effect influenced the perception of Gaelic women's poetry either within or out with the Gaeltacht. And it's the out with I'll focus on primarily, though this is a necessarily brief introduction today. More generally, Mcpherson's effect is very well documented, as we've also heard, and I have argued elsewhere that while James McLagan and his fellow collectors did not seek out the work of women poets for its own sake, or treat its arrangement within their collections differently to male contemporaries, the scale of their collective endeavour did preserve the work and the names of Gaelic women whose poetry would otherwise have been lost, whether or not this is coincidental. So Mcpherson, at least in part, may thereby take some small credit. As Richard Sharp has observed, McLagan and his colleagues mediated between the living literature in the oral tradition and the preserved text. Much of it found its way from the manuscript collections to the printed anthologies of John Gillies in 1786, the Stewart brothers Owen Young and Patrick Turner, and then onwards into the 19th century as well. Their work and many others, not least the continued survival of the oral tradition itself, also more than validates the vivid defence of this living literature, mounted in response to Samuel Johnson's famous dismissal of the Gaels as an illiterate and ignorant people, unable to analyse their past through the absence of documented history. The other well-documented effect of Mcpherson's Ossian is, of course, its contribution to the development of the Highland Tour, explored most recently by the excellent Curious Travellers project, the exhibition to which this event belongs tonight, and by our chair, Professor Leask's wonderful new book, which inspired the premise of my topic today. As he and many others have observed before, significant numbers of tourist visits to the Gaeltacht in the wake of the 1760s either coincided with or were inspired directly by a fondness for Mcpherson. Characteristic is Malvina's devotee Elizabeth Montagu, who carried an edition of Ossian's poems in hopes of recognising their locations in situ and wished that the poet's ghost might serenade her as she dined. In 1766, she is also among the earliest self-documented female tourists to the Highlands, followed by 4 who would publish their accounts, and approximately 36 as catalogued by Betty Hageland, who penned unpublished but preserved descriptions of their trip. That's in English. There are other continental examples. Starting out on this project at the height of lockdown, I had little idea how much to expect of these women's level of engagement with the lives of those women they encountered, specifically to what extent they might display an interest in the lives of Gaelic-speaking women who, like themselves, may have aspired to compose or to celebrate their lives or their own words, in their own words, or using others. So my primary interest lies out with the realm of social improvement, in which a number of these women writers did indulge and which has been longer recognised. Respecting these writers' anticipated lack of Gaelic, did they seek bilingual hosts' opinions on more recent products of the Gaeltacht's oral tradition, or was it assumed that such talent was confined to the distant past? Lastly, might the interest or their devotion in some cases to Malvina have inspired an interest in discovering the work of her modern day sisters? and for tedious access-related reasons, I haven't yet been able to pursue Montague's account on this basis thus far. I know that her correspondence is extensive. What follows, fairly briefly, is a selection of initial observations from a number of these women's accounts of their Highland tours. At this stage, it presumes only to reflect on the following questions: whether the descriptions authors was interested by the prevalence of Gaelic, or whether they observed local women beyond comments on their civility or manner of dress. So, did they attempt to engage in conversation? Did they display an interest in poetry or in local custom that relates, for instance, to a social practice such as work, death, or burial, each of which in the Gaeltacht is typically accompanied by song or other forms of verbal utterance? In this regard, we have contemporary descriptions of work songs that accompanied milking, spinning, or walking cloth, even observed by Samuel Johnson. And we also have the wealth of Gaelic life in the Highlands contemporaneously that was described by the Gaelic, obviously male social historian John Ramsay of Ochtertyre, as my fellow speaker Donald William has discussed. Might any of these tourists' journals provide the opposite perspective, so a female outsider's description of similar events that predates those preserved in the later 19th and early 20th centuries? And if that were the case, could their interest be attributed in any form to Ossianic influence? Conversely, therefore, it's instructive to focus initially on Dorothy Wordsworth's deservedly renowned Collections of a Tour Made in Scotland, which refers to the visit she made in 1803 in the company of her brother William. As our chair has observed, the Wordsworths allege remarkable indifference to the Ossian mania that otherwise surrounds them. However, while Dorothy comments often and with delicacy on many aspects of the women's lives whom they encounter, and observes that the conversations between those women take place in Erse or the Gaelic, she doesn't appear to take an interest in the language for its own sake, other than observing local place names, which is very common. Moreover, while her account is also remarkable for its uncommon lack of recourse to picturesque or sublime description of the Highland landscape, she is not above the occasional remark that reifies the Gaelic in a similar way. At Loch Etchev, for example, Dorothy describes the boatmen shouting to each other in Erse as a savage cry to our ears in that lonely and romantic place. Aside from the famous encounter with the singing Highland girls who inspired her brother William's poem The Solitary Reaper, from which I've borrowed my title, Dorothy's direct observation of the oral tradition is otherwise confined to an old woman at a house beside Loch Lomond who sang doleful Erse songs to a wailing child. And if Dorothy inquired of those songs' meaning at the time, it is unrecorded. In contrast, the 16-year-old Eliza Dawson, who completed her tour in 1786, is more characteristic of Mcpherson's female fans, admiring recent renovations to Ossian's Hall, Dunkeld Hermitage, and its extraordinary view, including its famous revolving painting of Ossian and the Muses, whom Dawson refers to as the Celestial Nine. I'm indebted to Alex Deans's excellent introduction to Dawson's account for pointing out that she herself, in later life, dismissed the sentimentality of her teenage journal, which abounds in the bad taste of the time. I'm sure many of us can sympathise, but she includes her passion for Mcpherson in this regret. Like Dorothy Wordsworth, Dawson observes that many locals spoke nothing but Erse, but while she refers frequently to popular contemporary literature in English, even by female poets such as Hannah More, she doesn't extend this to the Gaelic or potential local authors. Like Dawson, Charlotte Malkin and Elizabeth Susanna Graham included a visit to Ossian's Hall on their tours undertaken in 1814 and 1818 respectively. Malkin, like Elizabeth Montagu, was very well educated and displays a clear interest in Scottish literature, meeting with James Hogg and with Burns's widow Jean Armour, but she again makes no reference to contemporary Gaelic poets. I was delighted by the fact that she describes one of her hostesses as beautiful as Malvina, but unfortunately this didn't translate to seeking out the work of other actual women poets. However, I was very excited, I am very excited by several aspects of Elizabeth Graham's account of her visit in 1818, which was undertaken in the company of her daughter Maria. Alex Deans observes that, quote, the mother-daughter relationship of the two travellers sheds light on the gender and class dynamics of tourism in the period, with the younger Maria tackling paths that are deemed too bad for a lady to attempt, unquote. And it's tempting to suggest that this dynamic is also responsible for the women's conversation with two of the female servants in a house on Mull, the house of Colonel Campbell of Knock, whom they invite to their room after supper in order that the servants may sing to them in Gaelic. It's also possible that this occasion had an Ossianic connection, since Graham also records that Colonel Campbell, during supper, recollected an old man who used to chant Ossian's poems in Gaelic. Neither Dawson's, Malkin's nor Graham's accounts were published, which is not the case for my final examples, Elizabeth Spence's tour in 1811, and of course Sarah Murray, Lady Aust, whose tour appeared initially in 1799 and was expanded to include the Hebrides in 1803. For reasons of time, I'll refrain from further introduction to Murray, whose tour is justly well critiqued, but it should be observed that her famously caustic wit is also applied to Gaelic, which she describes hearing spoken as like the confusion at the Tower of Babel. She is, however, the only example I've found so far of a published attempt by a non-Gaelic speaking woman to provide her readers with a phonetic description of basic phrases in Gaelic, in addition to observing that its alphabet has 8 fewer letters than the English language. Nonetheless, again, Murray doesn't refer to Gaelic poets, and the nature of her sporadic observations, like Wordsworth, that local workers sing in the language, creates the suspicion that she does not consider such songs might have actual verses. For example, I was struck by the contrast to her babelizing of more obvious conversation, with her praise for the carters at Dalnacardoch, male carters, who regale her with soft, sweet Gaelic ditties, she observes, that delighted my ear. The melody of the Gaelic tunes was sung by a tolerable voice. Now turning lastly to Elizabeth Spence, whose book, unlike Murray's, was dismissed by contemporary critics on its publication in 1811, we find the fullest and most intriguing engagement with Gaelic literary tradition and its purveyors. As Pam Perkins has observed, Spence's account focuses regularly on other women writers, itself unusual, including the Scots peasant poet Christian Milne, who's otherwise barely documented. Therefore, the fact that Spence does not refer by name to any of those women writers' Gaelic contemporaries would seem to confirm the suspicion that this kind of information may simply have been unavailable to visitors to the Gaeltacht who did not also speak its language. Spence cannot be otherwise accused of a lack of interest. She is among the handful of contemporary writers to discuss the work of male Gaelic poets, referring to Donnacha Ban's praise of Ben Dorain and providing a lengthy account of the career of Ian Lown MacDonald of Keppoch, who died around 1700. There is a tantalising absence in the latter, which describes the poet's pursuit of the notorious Keppoch murderers in 1663. Ian Lown addressed the crime and praised its prosecutors several times, but there is also the so-called Sisters' Lament, composed in Gaelic, credited to the sibling of the murdered chieftains who also discovered their bodies, and Spence doesn't mention this directly, but she does include a detail that's identical with one of the verses of that lament, namely that opening the chamber door to discover the bodies, the brother's blood spilled over her shoes. So I'm not quite sure where she gets this from, but it implies that she did know about the poem, maybe, or that somebody had told her an otherwise incomplete account. She also, and this is where I will close, observes the funeral of the good Sir James, the 8th Baronet of Grant, who died in February 1811. On arrival at the family tomb, Spence records that his funeral cortege was greeted by a number of old women prepared to say the Coronach, a lamentation used at Highland funerals. In a footnote to her text, Spence cites Thomas Pennant's description of this event, which accords with what our chair has described as her general ambition to feminise Pennant's narrative, one of the elements for which her book was criticised. What I think is unique, however, is that Spence mingles what's clearly a first-hand description of James's Coronach and the mood it inspired among his mourners, with a distinctly Ossianic sensibility, as well as comparing its passion to Miltonian lament. And I'll quote this in full before I conclude. The Coronach, she says, which, like Milton's, is named of loud lament, is a voluntary tribute of clamant sorrow poured forth over the grave of a chief to protect and show kindness to those that live under them. A true Highlander of the old race attaches the same consequence to the Coronach that the Fingalians do to the songs of the bards, without which their spirits could not mount the viewless winds, nor reach the cloudy hills of their fathers. Those who send forth the dismal sounds do it under the impression of real sorrow. And I think that's quoting or paraphrasing part of one of Ossian's speeches too. I'm conscious of needing to conclude, and Spence's wonderful episode may be the most appropriate place to pause. This project remains in its infancy due to the number of as yet unconsidered primary sources, so I'm hesitant to draw a firm conclusion prematurely. What I hope to have shown is that the Ossian effect is not insubstantial, of course, but doesn't appear to have inspired any greater interest among his travel-writing female fans in Gaelic literary tradition or poetry for its own sake, and certainly not in concerted attempts to discover Malvina's living sisters, though I'm reserving judgment on Elizabeth Montagu for the moment. I also have a suspicion that Spence's her remarkable focus on Ian Lown derives from her thorough acquaintance with the existing commentary of a significant Scottish women writer who was also, at least in part, a learner of Gaelic, and this is Anne Grant of Lagan, whom I've omitted thus far on the basis that she would have taken over, but also who doesn't fully count as a properly external source on the contemporary Gaeltacht. Spence's book describes an endearingly giddy meeting with Grant during her tour, where they discuss some of Grant's publications. One of these, Letters to the Mountain, makes reference to a Coronach, although it doesn't include the Fingalian echoes that Spence then adds. Grant's is also one of the first attempts to translate into English an elegy composed by Ian Lown's kinswoman and contemporary Shealas na Ceapach of Ceapach, another MacDonald poet who was one of the most prolific Gaelic women poets of the 18th century. And Grant, lastly, is the only author prior to the 1840s who attempted to provide English readers with an even slightly comprehensive impression of the literary custom of the Gaeltacht, and in this regard her influence must be acknowledged as far greater than Mcpherson's. So as this project proceeds, I hope to deepen these comparisons and also to make that balance between Mcpherson's apparent denial of female poetic agency in Gaelic and the external perceptions of the oral tradition as well. Moran Tang, and thank you again for the invitation.
Kate, thank you so much. That was a wonderful survey, and just reminding us how important the Ossian factor has become in our own day, which is so exciting. And of course, joining you with your challenge to Samuel Johnson, who lambasts us for the apparent absence of documented history. You've demonstrated beautifully where we can go. So our next and final speaker is Louise McConaughey, lecturer in Celtic and Gaelic Studies in the University of Glasgow. And Louise's talk is English Perceptions of the Highlands and Islands in the Long Century Before Bert. So, Gomort, Louise, more than time.
Tapalaib Uisdean agus tapalaib Nigel Leask. Just the Korean screen now. So, stepping westward, then the writing Highland Tour 1720 takes us as a starting place Edward Bert's letter from the north of Scotland. Bert had some difficulties with the landscape in the Highlands, mountains described as monstrous excrescences which could be considered a land of ambush, and I quote here from Stepping Westward. The idea of travelling in the Highlands, at least travel by land, was greatly facilitated by the roads built by the army in which Burt served from 1726 onwards. And again, to quote from Stepping Westwards, the roads paved the way for the development of new romantic interiority, allowing the tourist to cultivate an aesthetic response to the unfolding landscape while travelling at an accelerated pace, rather than scrutinising their next footfall, wary of stumbling into bogs, holes and other obstructions. This then is a watershed, the English taming of the Highlands, tied up, as has been pointed out, with the beginnings of the Highland Tour. So what came before this then? Was it really terra incognita for the English? And that's really my starting point. English perspectives, perceptions of the Highlands. Now, I'm much happier with 16th and 17th century, and I try wherever possible to avoid the 18th century. A lot of bad things happen there. Of course, they do in the 17th century too. But coming to things from a 17th century perspective, I think some of the assumptions made in the 18th century are open to some question. It's undeniable that pace of change clearly accelerated exponentially in the 18th century, and relationships in these islands became transformed, especially after the Union of 1707. This can mean that longer-term perspectives and continuities get overlooked, elided, or downplayed, and William offered a useful corrective in his talk earlier on to some of this when he pointed out that the deeper roots of the cattle trade. Yet a lot of the prevailing writing suggests that, if we look at Haldane's classic study, for example, that there was little to no cattle trading, say brigandage, in the Highlands prior to 1707. Now, such a view is expressed in its most cartoonish and provocative way by Hugh Trevor Roper, who held that only following the conquest of Culloden could the Highlands be fully opened up for trade and improvement. Now, this isn't the case. Now, I should have explained what my map was. This is a map 1610, a map by John Speed, showing in the cartouches the royal family, James, Anne, and two crown princes. This map was reprinted in the mid-17th century, and we had the addition of a Highland man and a Highland woman there. This map in itself, however, Speed's English map, was a copy to some extent of a much earlier English map. So I realise I've got my maps a wee bit mixed up at this point, but this is takes us its base map. I think Lawrence Nowell's map from 1565. Fiolach MacLeod has argued in Tuchel Cheape that the informant for this map is likely to have been a Gael, possibly John Elder of Caithness. And if we zoom in on some of these, a bit of detail from this, you can see at the top coast there, you can see Balnaheaclush, Elan Hounde, which must have been written or information supplied by someone who knew what they were talking about. It also looks at the Marmor Hills of Sutherland and the Alabaster Hills of Ross, but I draw your attention to the horrible hills of Ardmanoch, these horrible hills of Ardmanoch, which we'll return to in a later slide. Now, again, back to Hugh Trevor Roper, if one was going to sort of try and visualize this perspective, with apologies to the BBC, we could come up with something like this. It's not the only way of looking at things. We could reverse this perspective, of course, and that's a sort of Hebridean-centric perspective of the world. So if you wanted to put Gaelic at center of things, you could, to borrow Russian terminology, think about the far abroad and the near abroad being the Gaeltach, or the lowlands, and the far abroad being England. And although I'm going to talk about English perspectives predominantly, I think it's worth just taking a wee bit of time to remind ourselves, or we've heard from Peter about 18th century and Glasgow. There are precursors to this. Donald Munro's travels to the Hebrides in 1549 mean that, as Charles Withers has observed, we know more of the Isles from this period than of any other part of Scotland. At the other end of the sort of period I'll be looking at, Scianoch Martin Martin's travelogue of 1695 gives us a wonderfully full glimpse of society in the Isles. Well-travelled James Fraser, currently the subject of some study, I believe, by Professor David Worthington of the UHI, from Cnocrwtha near Inverness, has left us an account of his travels, he's a Gael, through England, through Europe in the mid-17th century. And Robert Munro, another Gael from Easter Ross, wrote the earliest surviving regimental history anywhere in his account of Mackay's regiment and the role in the 30-Year War. Now, this account by Munro not only provides us with a blow-by-blow account of the regiment's progress, marching and fighting, but it also had a keen eye on Danish husbandry, how they handled their cattle, agriculture, economic practices and learning. Indeed, Donald Mackay, Lord Grey's son and heir in the mid-17th century, was educated not in lowland Scotland or England, but at Sorrow Academy in Denmark. Mackenzies, Mackays, MacLeods all had a well-established presence in the Netherlands during the 17th century. And a recent study of Scots domiciled in London by Alan Kennedy and Keith Brown draws our attention to how some of the Munros from Easter Ross were becoming English, I quote, assimilating into their host society by the end of the 17th century. So clan chiefs, the Highland elites, were among the many Scots frequenting London. Both the Earls of Argyll and Seaforth, for example, lodged in London during the 1630s. So while the focus on the rest of the papers on an English perspective, it's worth reminding ourselves that it might be worth keeping an eye on other perspectives too. So what about English or external perspectives then? It may be true that Burt's wonderfully detailed and letters offer us the earliest sustained English literary estimation of the Gaeltacht. Martin Rackwitz, in his wide-ranging travels to Terra Incognito, also starts his book with a quote from Edmund Burt, and the centre of his gravity of his compendium is really the 18th century and beyond, although it does try and mop up some earlier sources. And rather surprisingly, at least from a 17th century perspective, Rackwitz makes the claim that English interest in Scotland between the Union of the Crown and the Union of the Parliaments was negligible. And this despite drawing on one or two of these accounts. Now, it's true that we lack any extended travel writing from the 17th century, with three exceptions. We've got Tucker, Kirk, and John Taylor. But I would contest certainly the claim, even though we lack travel writing, of a lack of English interest. So England had been united under the composite monarchy under the Stuart monarchs since 1603. So why in 1720 is this still a mystery? Well, Burt, of course, was part of an occupying force and an administrative regime imposed in the Highlands in the wake of the failed Jacobite risings of 1715, 1719. Yet the Gaeltacht had also forced itself into metropolitan English consciousness during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms and, of course, the Jacobite risings. If we take firstly then Rockfitz's claim that there had been little English engagement with the Highlands, I think we can question some of this. So right the way back to the start of the century, we find that the second attempt at plantation in Lewis in 1605, the first attempt had failed. Second attempt in 1605 was backed up by English naval support. In fact, news of the gunpowder plot arrived in Edinburgh via Lewis, having travelled by ship round the north of Scotland. So you have English pirates, certainly from 1603 onwards, and probably earlier, but certainly from 1603 onwards, active in Hebridean waters. People like Peter Love, who was captured by Neil MacLeod of Lewis in 1610. And so there's a burst of piratical activity in Hebridean waters. This brings people like William Monson, who I'll look at later, Admiral William Monson, who a naval captain who was in pursuit of some of these pirates. And Richard James, another English, this is an English travel writer who does mention some of this piratical activity too. There was English support for operations in the Isles to pacify the Isles from 1608, and Bishop Knox, who's well known for the Statutes of Iona, was ferried around the Isles on an English pinnace called the Moon. The Isla Rising was suppressed with the aid of English forces under Colonel Lambert, based in Ulster, nearby Ulster. And there was extensive English involvement in the ironworks run by the Mackenzies at Wester Ross in the 1620s. The Mackenzies had long, since the 16th century, had an iron working operation, but in conjunction firstly with Sir George Hay and then with English partners brought in by the Earl of Seaforth, they attempted to develop this further, setting up a blast furnace and eventually casting cannon by the end of the 1620s. One of the English specialists that Seaforth hired, and we'll look at the names in bold, we'll look at briefly, to help them develop this, was a man called Stephen Inscombe from Sussex. Now, English workers were present at Strathcarron in Ross. There was a sawmill run by the English in Easter Ross in the 1620s, and large quantities of timber were being taken out of the Ross of Balnagowan lands in 1705. There was an full-on English colony in Lewis between 1630 and 1638. I will look at Captain John Deems later. He was acting under the command of the governor of the English colony in Lewis, Captain John Mason. Now, Mason was in turn someone who knew the Isles very well. He'd someone who's working in an Atlantic context, the governor of Newfoundland, part of the wider English sort of focus on resources in the Isles. He'd also been sourcing timber and woods on the grant of Fruchy lands in the 1630s. Phineas Pett, His Majesty's shipbuilder, was present in Inverness in the 1660s for the same reason, sourcing timber. In fact, he had a landed interest in Inverness. And of course, lest it be forgotten, the Cromwellian usurpation, as the continuator of Sir Robert Gordon's history called it, saw the occupation of the Highlands with garrisons quite widely across the Highlands, including Stornoway, Inverness, Lochaber, and elsewhere. So quite a widespread contact then. This is a map from a Dutchman or German, Captain John Slazer, of Inverness, showing the town of Inverness, and down at the river mouth there you can see the harbour and some ships, and up there you can see the castle from the present site of the present castle. This is dates from around the 1690s, but it's worth thinking here about this, and also the second picture I've shown you, which is Chanonry. So both of these areas were Gaelic-speaking areas visited by Captain Slater. But this had an impact, the English had an impact on the built, on the architecture of these places too. And this is how it was remembered by Mr. Hector Mackenzie, who was for a time the only Gaelic-speaking minister of Inverness. He pointed out in his history of the Clan Mackenzie, which that the steeple, this is the steeple at Channery, this second image there, stood in the cathedral of Channery, very magnificent, until it was cast down by the English. The stones thereof brought to Inverness to build the citadel. Now, I'm not sure if that's the citadel pictured there or not, but that's kind of beside the point in a way. The point is that this is remembered by people on the ground, the presence of these English people. They also had a frigate in Loch Ness in the 1650s, expecting to chase down brigands and restore order. Well, how was so? There's no doubt, I think, of the intermittent presence of the fact of the intermittent presence of English in Scotland. So how then was Gaelic Scotland imagined in England? Well, there'd been growing antipathy in Scotland from James VI downwards, of course, to the Gaels on the Gaeltacht from Basilic and Doran, 1597, and I won't really dwell on this too long, but there was a well-developed lowland Scottish anti-Highland prejudice by the end of the 16th century. Now this fueled existing, presumably, narratives in England too. Here we have a rather nattily dressed Tudor-clad Tudor fashions, Macbeth and Banquo encountering the witches in Holinshed's Chronicles, which fueled, was the fuel on which Macbeth drew for, Shakespeare drew for Macbeth. Now, Macbeth, this gives us a very broad and crude cultural barometer of how what perceptions are held, I would argue. So he's talking about merciless MacDonald from the Western Isles, of Cairns and Gallaglas is supplied. Now, Christopher Hiley, who's, from his work I draw in here, shows that Macbeth was being pictured here at the end of this play in Macbeth as having himself lapsed into Gaelic barbarism. So really what I want to argue then is that the English perception of Scots Irishry was as barbaric, warlike, and speaking an English tongue. Now, the MacDonalds were well known, of course, to the English who'd encountered them in Ireland much of the 16th century. And at this point, I draw your attention to the Ballad of Gilderoy, published in the 16th century. Now, the actual poem itself, interesting although it is, Gilderoy was a bonny boy, need not detain us too long. Apart from observing that this is published in England, it has printings in Edinburgh too, and it seems to have gone viral, collected from oral tradition in Norfolk in 1901. That's Gilderoy himself. The actual person on whom this is based, Patrick MacGregor, had been a notorious outlaw in the Eastern Highlands, captured and executed in 1636. At least one other Gael made it into English consciousness. That's Alistair MacCulloch. John Milton referred to Gordon Colkitto or MacDonald or Galasp. These rugged names to our mouths grow sleek that would have made Quintilian stare and gasp. And one other stream of evidence perhaps we could look at is the Ballad of ballads such as the Ballad of Lord Lorne. Now this is supposed to be an older, have its roots in 16th or 15th or 16th century. But if we look at the first paragraph there, the worthy Lord of Lorne He was a lord of high degree. He sent his son into the school to learn some civility. For me, that I suggest has been reworked. It echoes the statutes of Iona. If we look at another broadside published in England from this period, I mean, probably published in Scotland too, we see valiant jockeys marched away to fight the foe with great Mackay. Great Mackay, and the verse off the screen refers to rebellious Highlanders later, is none other than General Mòr Ostaig, General Hugh Mackay of Scourie, commander of the Williamite forces at Killiecrankie. So this gives us some indication of how elite Highlanders are perceived on the British stage. Perhaps there's not even much evidence that Lord of Lorne or Mackay there had any sort of barbarous antecedents. It should be pointed out that all my evidence pretty much relates to males, but two of the protagonists I mentioned earlier, Robert Munro Fowlis and Don Mackay, were both sued for alimony by English women at various points. So in terms of English travellers' accounts per se, then we have, we don't have too much. We've got John Taylor, the water poet, who's well known, and I'm not going to dwell on him here. Tucker, Kirk and Mora, all of these feature in Hugh Brown's early travellers in Scotland. To this could be added Richard James, perhaps, with the exception of Professor David Stevenson. He's been overlooked by pretty much everyone, I think. An Oxford graduate, first librarian of the Cottonian Library, from which the collection of the British Library later developed. He's also a travel writer in Wales, Greenland, but also in Scotland, and the Scottish leg of his travels have been published, Evan McGilvary in 1953. He discusses mainland Highlanders and their dress. They're a healthful, strong, able and proper people, given to fighting, quarrelling and sudden murders. It talks about Highland dress and weapons. It's got all sorts of really interesting information. And coming to this from a Lewisman's perspectives, it talks about the Lewis people being a strange, uncivil people, robbing and spoiling such merchant ships and fishermen as are forced into their parts. In terms of then compensating for the lack of travel writing, if we wanted to examine English perspectives from the 17th century, one of the experts brought in by Seaforth to help develop his iron works in Wester Ross and assess the potential of the area and the works for expansion, talks in the passing about his experiences in travel. I found a ship going for Leith. I thought it best to go away with her. The land way is so extremely laborious and dangerous. The long mending of the ship hath given him much occasion to think about the business. And again, I cannot do it for myself, for want of a Scotch gentleman who can speak the language, who's both honest and plausible to this people. So these are themes that you find later on and in other travel writing, I think. Language and difficulties of travel. Now, in terms of the English colony, I'm just going to really skim through this very quickly because I'm conscious of taking too much time. This is driven by English naval cabal in the 1630s for reasons I'm not going to dwell on, except to highlight the importance of resources in the north to the English, especially timber and iron. And the Earl of Seaforth is in league with Dutch partners in Middleborough and engaging commercially with them. So the English can't countenance this. If you want to read in detail on this, there's W.C. Mackenzie's History of the Outer Hebrides and also Plantation and Civility, which covers this in some depth. But William Monson is a really interesting man. He's been all over the western seaboard of Ireland and the Hebrides up to Shetland, undercover in Baltimore and chasing pirates in the north of Scotland. The nature and disposition of the people, you shall receive them from me who have seen them and who can speak or best speak of them. Hebrides is a great place. You have to bear in mind that he is looking for raising capital in a share company in around 1630. So Lewis yields without the labour of the people, which they are not guilty of, all manner of grain, cattle, fish, fowl. So it's paradise. It's just people by really dodgy character. They have a good land and they are ill people. The world can't show a more barbarous, bloody and untamed generation. Monson's remedy for this was a 6-point plan, which included recommendations that His Majesty appointed Governor Stornoway and a citadel to keep these people in obedience, for the inhabitants of these islands are naturally inclined to incivility, treachery and liberty, which are the next neighbours to rebellion. And the other things that Monson recommended was that every child be taught the English or Scotch language, and that above all the natives have no correspondence with the Hollanders. So the plan of the English was to break the Mackenzie and link with the Dutch and replace it with themselves naturally. Now, Captain John Deems, the actual governor on the ground in Lewis was Captain John Mason, but his subordinate John Deems prepared maps and also a description of the activities of Clan Mackenzie and the Dutch. Again, talking about Lewis men, as for the inhabitants, the language is a kind of bad Irish. They're altogether likened to the Highlanders, but now much more obedient to the laws. It tells us that in between around 1610 and around 1630, 4,000 people lived in Lewis in 1630, a great part of which had been brought out of the nearby mainland. Talks about the commodities, and he also drew a map of the harbour. Now, the importance of this to the English was such that it was occupied again in the 1650s, and that's a plan. The first plan was from Deems in the 1630. This plan is more detailed by the Cromwellian garrison in the 1650s. And I'm coming to the end of my slides now. But one of the other ways in which we could assess or gauge potentially the English opinions of the Highlands and perspectives on the Highlands was to look at the reportage in newspapers, journals, and so on. Here we have an account from the camp of English expedition in Kintail in 1654, and I'm going to skate through this at some speed. It talks about the people, it talks about them as living in huts, the heathens, rebels, universally in rebellion. He really didn't like the weather, the writer of this. He talks about the foulness of the weather, having much rain, the mountains and the landscape, the badness of the ways through almost inaccessible passages on edges of mountains. I'm confident worse places will not be found. And if you remember the map at the top of the PowerPoint presentation, we've passed by the high mountains of Ardmanoch, where I believe never English army marched before. And again, he's banging on about the weather and the tempestuousness of the night by a violent storm of wind, hail and rain will not permit me to enlarge. One almost feels sorry for him. So then to conclude, I apologies for if I overrun a little bit. So it's fair to say I think that the travel writing doesn't really start, or at least we don't have a substantial enough corpus to be regarded as such, with some exceptions, until the early 18th century. However, the idea coming from, certainly from Blackfoot's, and it's very useful peg to hang this on, that that the English involvement in the Highlands is negligible, needs some revision. It's demonstrably the case that the Highlands were engaged with the English component of the British state when they needed to be, and often on their terms. I think that's the key difference between what happens in the following century to some extent. Some Englishmen can be shown as having been physically present, but lacking such a corpus of travel writing as we do for later centuries, we must perhaps cast our net wider. But I think it's worth doing. There's currently some scholarly focus on the Scots in England, but there's little, I think, what's been done on the English in Scotland during the 17th century. And this is something that's, people living every day in the 17th century were constantly reminded of the royal style. Was King of Scotland, England, Ireland, and France. Visits to court, where to London after 1603, if you wanted to influence or press your case at court, you had to go to London. So there's a growing engagement with England, I think. It could be argued you'd have a thinner evidence base, but you could say that there's a growing engagement with England, perhaps from the 16th century. But certainly this is much more sustained, if intermittent, during the 17th century. And I'll end it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Nurse. That was fantastic, and bringing in so much that really is not familiar to most of us and to many of us. Nigel, would you like to pick up from there?
Well, I thank you, Anish. It's like the backstory to Old Ways, New Roads. It's the story behind the story we're trying to tell that often gets just ignored. And you just drew attention to these really important foundations. And really, someone like Bert can only be understood in relation to some of the English writers and travelers you discussed in that very learned talk. So many thanks. Okay, well, sadly, I think we probably will need to draw this wonderful session to a close. So, Moran Tang, Cheery and Drasta. Hope we'll see you all the next session. And a special thanks to our speakers.
Indeed.